Okay, so this continues the Come Follow Me series that I've been doing. We're going to talk about Doctrine and Covenants section 27 through 28. And for this section, I would like to focus on one theme in particular that I think is really important, especially as the times are changing and we are entering into a new phase of our life when it comes to what to expect in the future regarding the end times and the Lord's coming. And these themes that I'll discuss here are very pertinent to those things. And so let's get going. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is the idea of deception. So we know that the Come Follow Me for this week talks about Hiram Page and the Seer Stone. And I'm not going to go much into the history of that. I think we kind of all have a basic sense. And I don't think going into the history is the best use of the time. And so instead, I want to focus more about this idea of deception, because what you saw with Hiram Page is you had many people who were deceived, even Oliver Cowdery, who had been visited by an angel a few times, who was the second elder of the church, so pretty high standing. And even Joseph Smith himself was a little confused as to what was going on. And the other interesting thing is the nature of Hiram Page's revelations, which appear to be very prophetic, and the same way he was using a seer stone. So there's some interesting things going on here when it comes to deception, and the early church had to grapple with it, and we'll have to grapple with it some more as the times unfold and we enter into the end times, or as we proceed through the end times, depending which your view is. So the scriptures teach a lot about deception, and they warn us. In Doctrine and Covenants section 50, for example, the Lord tells that Satan has sought to deceive the leaders of the church, that he might overthrow you. Interesting thing there is that deception is linked to Satan's power over us. And that would make sense because Satan's power lies in deceit and trickery, in getting us to believe a false thing instead of the real thing. And that's how Satan gets us. And by doing that, he gets the upper hand. He lures us in, traps us in. We don't have the knowledge to contend with it. We've gone the wrong way. And then he can feed us whatever lies he wants to that keeps us busy and distracted from the real truth. We also know that in the end times, there will be an antichrist of some sort who will come and do many miracles and will deceive many people by reason of those miracles. And even Nephi talks about that as well. And so this is something that will certainly happen. But then we also have in Matthew 7, it's a more general statement of deception overall. Many people claiming to be followers of the Lord, doing mighty works, but the Lord will reject them. And what that indicates is that this level of deception isn't just simply sharing some false idea or adopting a false idea, which is very possible, but it can also be through miracles, which we kind of saw with not, well, I guess Hiram Page is more with seers and revealing, but still kind of a supernatural using the seer stone like Joseph Smith. And so we can see that the devil is that crafty that he can use miracles and miraculous things and bring those to pass to deceive people. So how do we avoid deception? So in the Come Follow Me, and maybe in other places, maybe we've heard this answer is follow the prophet and trust our leaders. But is that really accurate? So here are some things I think are worth considering. And then we can kind of decide whether this idea of following the prophet is the best course of action. So one of the things is that Joseph Smith taught the opposite of what the Come Follow Me teaches when it comes to how to avoid deception. Joseph Smith warned us that just as a Jewish church during Ezekiel, as Ezekiel's talking about, was depending on men and relying on men, which he calls a corruption of the Jewish church, that people during Joseph Smith's time in the early church were doing the same things. And he calls that by relying on Joseph Smith and trusting on him solely, they become darkened in their minds. And um, and that be, because of that, they were not able to see the truth clearly. We also know in the scriptures of another time where the Lord allowed a prophet to be killed by a lion for trusting the words of another prophet over what the Lord commanded him. So this was a prophet Lord gave specific instructions to and told the man not to talk to anyone. And then a man came by who said he was a prophet and so forth. And the original man, the one that the Lord told not to speak with anyone, spoke with that prophet and violated the Lord's command, and the man was killed by a lion. So again, this idea that just trusting in a man or a purported man who is a prophet is not always the wisest thing, and the scriptures seem to speak against that. Again, another thing too is while the general message and counsel is to follow the prophet to avoid deception, that's not what section 28 is addressing. Right? The revelation from the Lord to Joseph Smith in section 28 was about who receives revelation for the church. It's not ever saying that Joseph Smith can't fall, that the way to avoid deception is just trust in the prophet. All it's just merely saying is who is given, when it comes to receiving revelation, how does that hierarchy distribute? And so to go beyond that is to read beyond the text, and it's not there. And further, it's contradicted by other parts of Doctrine and Covenants where it warns Joseph Smith that he could fall if he's not careful. And it also, we have in Doctrine and Covenants a system set up where if the president of the church did fall away, that there was a high council that there was a check on the president of the church and any leader of the church. And Joseph Smith at times is brought up before the high council. And so it is clearly shown in these Doctrine and Covenants that a leader can fall no matter how high up, and the Lord instituted systems to address when that happens. And the Lord, if it couldn't happen, the Lord would not have provided that system. And so the idea of Woodruff saying that the Lord would not allow a prophet to fail and fall is contradicted by the fact the Lord instituted systems to put a check on a leader in the church. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing as well is the other problem with putting trust in a person, even if he is considered to be a prophet, is he's still a man, and men are susceptible to making mistakes. But also, we give up our agency because if we place everything on that person, then we shift that responsibility and we don't take any accountability for what we're doing and for our search for truth and light. And so it's just, and that's why you become darkened, is because you're giving up the ability to acquire more light. You're becoming more of a object instead of an actor, an agent, and you allow someone else to kind of dictate how things go. And an example, kind of what that would look like too, is if you think about the initial stages of childhood, certainly a child needs to rely on his parents at the beginning because the child doesn't know anything. But eventually, if the child relies on his parents for everything, you can see where this goes. The child becomes almost, I mean, he's human, but it's not really human in the terms of the ability to act and to be an agent and to do things and to advance and to grow and progress. If a child needs to have the parent drive them everywhere they go and they're 17 or 20, 18, technically adult, but to say that extends further, and this adult always needs his parents around, he's not going to really amount to much. He's not going to really be able to do anything because he hasn't learned for himself. And that's kind of the same thing going on here. Is if we just turn everything over to the prophet, then we just say, well, I don't have to be worried, and you don't learn the tools of discernment and the principles that you need to flourish and grow. So how do we avoid deception then? So if it seems that following the prophet is not the best course of action for the reasons outlined, and also scriptures seem to warn against that. Even Nephi talks about trusting the arm of flesh, and that's a dangerous thing. Our real only trust, as the scriptures teach, is in Jesus Christ, right? Our salvation's in him, and that's where our faith goes. But in any case, that's a little broader. So then our faith is in Jesus, but still, how do we avoid that deception? And maybe we can flesh this out a little bit more by breaking it down into two ideas or two ways: truth and discernment. So the best antidote to deception, the best shield to deception and to avoid being deceived, is the truth. Because the truth is true, deception is a falsehood. So we counteract that falsehood with truth. And the scriptures teach us that this is certainly a way that we can overcome deception. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul is again talking about this Antichrist, the lawless one, as NIV puts it, who will have all sorts of power and deceive people. And he explains that these people perish because they refuse to love the truth and so to be saved. And then the Lord, in section 57, the Doctrine and Covenants, mentions the wise virgins in the parable and explains exactly what this oil represents and why these virgins were wise. And it says that they're wise because they received the truth and had the Holy Spirit for their guide, and as a result, had not been deceived. So truth is, to simply put, reality. It's things as they are, were, and will be. And so God exhorts us to seek after truth. But the question is, do we really want the truth as much as we say we do? So it's really easy to say, oh, I value the truth. But then what happens when that truth conflicts against certain beliefs that you hold? Do we hold certain beliefs that are not challengeable, certain sacred cows, beliefs that are beyond reproach, beyond challenging, certain beliefs that if someone did try to challenge, we would unfriend the person, not necessarily through social media, but even in real life, not talk to them anymore. They become offensive, emotional. And then even if our beliefs are challenged, how do we respond? Because there's one thing about having beliefs challenged. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good. It's almost a stress test. John Stuart Mill, who I admire a lot, spoke highly about exposing ideas to the marketplace of truth. And he truly believed that if you exposed ideas and had a vigorous and open discussion and debate even, that the truth will win out. Now, I think he was a little optimistic because he failed to take into account fallen nature. But the principle he advocated is still the right principle, and is how we should adopt anything in our lives. Is we should have whatever belief we have, we should hold it up to the light. That is, we should let it be scrutinized. We should share it with other people and then see what they say. And then if they disagree, see why, understand why, not with the purpose of trying to be right, but with the purpose of understanding. And then even if they share a belief or an idea, or they critique your belief and it's wrong, okay, so it's wrong. So what? There's no need to get emotional about it. And if you always set yourself up for being emotional, then you could miss the time when your beliefs do need to be tweaked a little bit. And we can see this happen in the scripture. I mean, I think Nephi comes to my mind, but there are others who had to grow in further understanding and had to shift some of their previous beliefs in light of new information. And that's certainly with I mix up King Lamoni, killing Laban, where Nephi saw that. At first, he said, "I never thought I would have to kill a man," and then he learned that that wasn't the case. That sometimes the Lord will command it, and so that was a whole shift in his belief system. And if Nephi always just kept to his belief that we were never to kill anyone, then he would have frustrated what the Lord could have done in his life. And so, truth is very important. So, it's ideas, but then it's also the truth about ourselves. And that's also really important as well. And I love ancient Eastern philosophy and even Western esotericism, which I've talked about a few times, because I have this idea about know thyself, knowledge of self. And what that really means is knowing who we really are. The modern world provides us so many ways to hide who we really are. We can do that through entertainment, through video games, sports. We can do it through careerism, where we just put our whole lives into our career and work insanely excessive hours just so that we can create a false self of ourselves through the wealth we acquire. We can do it through zoning out of the world. In the past, if you the past, like more agrarian societies, you had to live based on the land, and so you couldn't just escape from reality. But here, you can just order pizza and watch Netflix and remove yourself completely from the world and never having to face the hard truths about yourself. And so that's a big challenge right now for the modern world. And so these things about ourselves are revealed in our weakness and who we really are. And again, that's where trials are really, really valuable. And that's why they are a blessing, because they expose us to the limits of our current beliefs about ourselves and they challenge that. And so trials are one way, but people as well. Getting feedback from other people disagreeing, people actually pointing out a character flaw that you have. Do you consider that, or do you just get defensive and reject it or pout and distance yourself from the person? I had, I think, for a good chunk of my adolescence and up until my mission, I was very sensitive to how people, to feedback, and I took it very personally, and I had a hard time with it, and I would kind of insulate myself from feedback. And then I remember that I was still struggling and I was still suffering on my mission with some personal, just feeling inadequate. And I had a companion. We finally had a little blow up where he really told me who I was. He said, "You're a sensitive kid. You can't take anything." And I initially got upset, went silent, and sulked, and whatever. And then we finally had a discussion. And through this period, he helped me to understand how I was perceiving things and how often it was inaccurate. And it was that movement of actually going to him and saying, "You know what? You're right. I do take things personally. I am hard on myself." It helped me understand. And I'm so glad I did, because if I didn't, I don't know where I'd be today, because that set tone in a shift in my life that was monumental and exponential, and was actually really a blessing is the Lord. So I had a companion at the beginning of my mission, and I had that same companion at the end. And the companion was able to see how much I changed, because he had me in the beginning when I was just this sensitive and weak and borderline depressive kid to a more mature person who could handle my shortcomings. And that continued onward. But it was such a blessing that the Lord gave me that chance for the companion to tell me that, to say, you have changed. And I attribute it to that fact that I finally listened. I finally stopped pushing back against the feedback, and I started to embrace it. And I carried that with me, and carried it with me until even till today. It's just gone on hyperdrive. Where now any feedback, I actually like seek feedback, like tell me what I'm doing wrong here, just so I know. And so I embrace it. And those who follow after God do the same thing. And that's what humility is. That's why the Lord tells us to be humble. It's not simply to mean, oh, I'm no good. I mean, if you're an excellent guitar player, say you are. That's actually great. Glorify God. Use your skill as a guitar player to glorify God and play awesome music and not crappy pop music. Just kidding. Well, not kidding. But play good music. Play music that really glorifies Him and that is beautiful. And you can use that. Don't downplay your talents. That's not what humility means. That's almost another form of pride, because you're unwilling to acknowledge what the Lord has given you. No, humility is simply just being able to receive the truth, to be open to truth, be open to correction. There's a reason why Moroni, when he's talking about how to discern and find the good, states that humility is, I believe, a necessary condition. Might be sufficient. It's one of those two conditional terms, but it's without humility you can't progress unto faith, charity, and hope. And in David, King David talks about how the rod of the Lord and his staff comfort him. So if you recall back to an earlier video, I talked about the rod as source of discipline, and that's applicable here. So what David is saying is the Lord's discipline and correction comforts him. He gets comfort in being corrected. And you read that all the time in Psalms where David is asking for further correction, for the law of the Lord, which is Torah or teachings, correction. Even the very beginning of Psalms is a beautiful ode to the idea of correction, of comparing the wicked to the righteous, and how the righteous seeks after the teachings of the Lord, delights upon the teachings of the Lord, meditates upon that, and becomes a fruitful tree. Because a fruitful tree, because he learns where the weaknesses are, where the flaws are, the things that are holding him back, and can flourish. And so that's how humility plays such an important role, is it exposes our weaknesses and allows us to actually achieve and be the thing that God desires us to be. So seek the truth, value it, hold it to your bosom, whatever it is, even the hard parts. So ultimately the truth, to love the truth, to be a truth seeker, is to even embrace the hard parts. And your conscience will also tell you what that is. So we've got the truth part down. Now let's just quickly touch on discernment. Discernment is crucial. In Hebrews, Paul teaches that the spiritually mature are those who are unable to discern, that is, unable to bear the meat. The meat of the gospel isn't necessarily deep doctrine. And some of that deep doctrine is false doctrine, so it's just a waste of time. But the meat of the gospel consists in being able to discern between good and evil, to use reason, knowledge, and the Spirit to determine what is good and not rely on some person to tell you, right? Because that's what God, who He is. He doesn't rely on someone to tell him what to do. He goes out and He conquers the world or worlds. He organizes, He creates, He enlivens, and He does that through the reason, knowledge, and the Spirit. And He uses that to orchestrate His plans. And so this idea of reason, knowledge, and the Spirit is exactly what the wise virgin parable talks about, and what Doctrine and Covenants, as we just saw, said. It says that the virgins are wise, that is, they employ reason. They have received the truth, as they possess gained knowledge and have taken the Holy Spirit for their guide and have not been deceived. And so discernment consists in this triumvirate of application. It's using reason, knowledge, and the Spirit. And so basically what we want to do is we want to acquire all the truth that we can find, and we can do that through experience, through study, through revelation. And then based on that, we use the reason we've acquired in the Spirit, based on the storehouse of knowledge we have, to then come to conclusions. And this idea of discernment is iterative. It means you come back to it over and over again. It's one eternal round. And that phrase has a bigger meaning than we sometimes realize. But part of that means is that we're always circling back to this thing over and over again. Our life is a cycle. The Hebrew festival and its feasts are representing this cycle. Everything is a cycle, and we come back to it. There are even depictions of Jacob's ladder as more of a spiral. In Eastern or Western esotericism depicts ascension as a spiral, right? We are continually spiraling upward, but the spiral is important because we come back to the same thing over and over again, but just at a different point. We've raised up. We can see things differently now, and we come back to the problem in a new light and are able to address it better. And so this comes from acquiring knowledge, using what you have, the reason you have to come to decisions, make those decisions, learn from the mistakes. Even if what you did was the best at the time, hindsight will probably show you that, oh, I could have even done this even better. Apply that, hold on to it, and then when a similar event comes around, now you have greater ability to discern even more, or you have ability to discern even better option. You do that, then you reevaluate, come back, and do the same thing over and over again. And so experience is very valuable in this. For instance, I think a lot of people after COVID gained some wisdom and insight into the government and probably realized that the government isn't as virtuous or reliable as they thought, as they saw how the government used misinformation to push the lockdown and COVID vaccines, and they lied about the vaccines. And so it led to all these problems. And now through that experience, hopefully some people have grown wiser and have started to realize that the government isn't the panacea to problems, and they have their own agenda. But at the same time, there's that risk that we might throw out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to all vaccines. And so you have to be careful, and that's where discernment comes in. And then you study, you go out, you acquire knowledge through the scriptures, but also through books, any good books. And you then bring that to your storehouse and use that to base your decisions off of. And then you go to the Lord in prayer, let Him give you further guidance. And it's doing these things in an effort and an eye towards always improving that you can avoid being deceived, because you will start to see what others can't see. And so I encourage you to take this approach instead of the simple relying on a person approach, because in this approach, you will grow and produce fruit and avoid deception.